Like most hobbies, espresso can be pretty expensive, and essentially you can spend as much money as you want on an espresso machine. But when it comes down to those entry-level or beginner-friendly options, those are pretty limited, and many of them still cost well over $100. Of course, though, when it comes down to entry-level espresso options, you will likely have to make some concessions in one department or another. But what those departments are is really the big question. So today we're looking at Flair's recently updated beginner-friendly espresso maker, the Neo, to see what it brings to the entry-level user, how it performs in the cup, and what concessions were made to make it cost just $99. But first, in a spirit of full disclosure, the folks over at Flair sent me the Neo for review, of course after agreeing to my terms of no access to my draft or the contents of this video prior to full public release. So with that out of the way, we're going to dive right into it after a quick word from this video's sponsor, Standart Magazine. If you're into coffee, its culture, and learning about the world around it, Standart Magazine is the perfect addition to your brew bar or coffee table. With quarterly releases, they shed light on issues both inside and outside of the cafe, highlighting people who elevate the industry, and deep dives into new ideas around all things coffee. To sweeten the deal, each issue also includes a sample of coffee from some of the world's best roasters to give you the full sensory experience. You really can't beat the combination of fresh coffee and fresh print. So head on over to standartmag.com/Sprometheus, use the link in the description or code Sprometheus at checkout to snag $5 off your very own subscription of coffee and culture, shipped direct to your door nearly anywhere in the world with a money-back guarantee. And if you're still on the fence, you can actually try Standart today for just the cost of shipping. There's not a whole lot to lose and a whole lot to gain. Having used quite a few manual lever espresso machines over the years, including Flair's Pro and 58 models, the Neo isn't a massive departure from what you'd expect. Of course, you've got the frame, which arrives in two parts, and is put together purely by friction joints. The pieces themselves are made of plastic, or as Flair calls it, a high-strength ultralight polymer blend, which is absolutely very light, and together weighs just over 800 grams. And as you move into preparing to brew, the Neo also has two portafilter options. The red option, which is pressurized, and the black, which is non-pressurized. The pressurized option is essentially made for grinds that may be a little more coarse, or were ground with something a little less consistent like a blade grinder, because essentially what it does is holds back the release of the coffee until the pressure inside reaches a high enough threshold. But if you want to make true espresso, the black non-pressurized option is the way to go. But you will need a quality burr grinder for the black portafilter to work, because it fully relies on the back pressure created by the finer, more consistent grind size to produce traditional espresso. But in my opinion, what it produces is just so far superior to the pressurized portafilter, it's hard to even compare the two. The water cylinder design has been reduced in thickness to minimize its thermal mass. So on top of that saving some on the material cost itself, it also is aimed at heating faster, as well as not transferring as much of the water's heat to the cylinder itself, and according to Flair, you can actually skip the preheat altogether. Though the topic of preheating is one that's pretty debatable and honestly is more of a personal preference. But for me, in terms of preheating, I always do it with coffees that are medium or lighter to maximize the extraction potential. And finally, speaking of pressure, they've also now included a gauge with the Neo, which provides some much needed visual feedback to the overall tactile brewing process of a manual press. Of course, straight off the bat, I think the main selling point for at least most people on the Flair Neo is its price point. But I think the one thing we should talk about first and foremost is its espresso quality, because without that, being inexpensive really doesn't benefit anyone. But considering this is the pro section of the video, it should be a pretty solid clue that the espresso can be really good. And really that can be in that last sentence is the only major caveat to the Neo, because much like any other espresso machine, it's only as good as the grinder, the water, and of course the user, because if it isn't clear by now, on the Neo you have full control over the entire brewing process. So in the end, if your shot isn't good, you really only have one person to blame. But of course, I don't really want to give the implication or the impression that the Neo is hard to use, because it's pretty much the opposite. There's really only a handful of pieces to the entire kit, and most of them are pretty straightforward. But brewing on it is as simple as the grinds go into the portafilter with the help of the included funnel. You tamp them with the included tamper, which is a term we're going to use loosely for this plastic tube. Place the shower screen over it, secure it into the cylinder, pour in your boiling water, place the plunger in, and press it out. So with that said, in terms of espresso makers, especially options with this level of control and the potential quality of the outcome, it is fair to say that at $99, the Flair Neo is a bargain. But of course, as you may expect when it comes to something that's considered a bargain, oftentimes there are reasons why it's a bargain. Some concessions were made, and the Neo is not immune to those concessions, and I think there are some cons worth considering if you're in the market for one. And when it comes to the cons themselves, the Neo is not only affected by some of the issues that basically broadly affect most, if not all, manual press machines, but also it has a few of their own, which in many cases I think are the outcomes of cost cutting in the design and build to keep it at that $99 price point. So to start, one issue that I find to be pretty common in most hand press manual espresso machines is you are fairly limited in terms of your dose and your yield. And of course, the Neo is no exception to that. The cylinder itself is listed to fit a max of around 60 mils with a max pull of around 45. And the dose can be between 12 to 18 grams of coffee. But to hit those numbers, you'd have to really fill them up to the top. And in my experience, it's not all that realistic and has an overall negative effect on the brew itself. So I found most of my best shots landing around the tried and true 1:2 ratio, using a max dose of around 16 grams and a max yield close to 32 grams. Also, like most manual machines, the Neo suffers from a relatively tedious and time-consuming process of dialing in or making multiple shots. As you've seen already, a lot of the parts are small, and they can get rather hot when they're in use, and if you're pulling another shot, cooling it off more or less defeats the purpose. Plus, with the expansion of grinds in the small basket and the bits of water left over, can result in some overflow and things can get a little messy. But from there, the whole process of brewing starts all over, which, as I mentioned, isn't something that's difficult, but there are a handful of steps involved, and the time can really start to add up. Also, the brew gauge, though a useful visual tool in understanding one of espresso's biggest variables, doesn't have any actual numbers, so it makes repeatability shot to shot more of a guessing game, and design-wise it sits slightly too close to the top of the piston seat, resulting in the lever causing some slight tilt in the plunger during the press. But the biggest concern I have with the Flair Neo is its frame, because when you're brewing, there's just a lot of creaking and shifting happening. And in some cases, it slips out of the frame's friction teeth that hold it together on the back. So I found myself trying to more or less hold it together as I pressed through. And really, in terms of my overall experience with the frame, it did feel as though it was strong enough, but the creaks and the rattles really didn't fill me full of confidence in terms of its durability over the long haul, especially considering it's about $30 more for the Flair Classic, which has a metal frame. So to me, it seems like it may be worth waiting a bit longer and saving a bit more for that peace of mind. In the end, the Flair Neo hits all the right parameters to make a truly tasty espresso, and it does so relatively inexpensively. And if you can get by the inherent quirks of a manual machine and the creaks and rattles that come with its plastic frame, it's definitely one of the better entry-level options out there for those looking for the full espresso experience. Because much like espresso made on every other manual, or even most semi-automatic machines, it's finicky and requires a lot of patience with the processes that come along with making espresso. So it really is just a great gateway piece of equipment that helps you decide if you really want to take the full headfirst dive down the rabbit hole of home espresso before you spend a big chunk of change on more serious, maybe prosumer level gear. And on that note, I think it's time I start wrapping this one up, and as always, pass the conversation on to you. So what are your thoughts on the Flair Neo? If you're new to espresso or looking to get into it, does it seem like something you'd want to invest in or use? And if you're already into espresso and you've made the mistakes or spent the money, do you think that a manual machine is a great way to start out? And if so, or if not, do you have any other recommendations? So drop your answers to those questions and any others you may have in the comment section down below. And as always, I'll see y'all in the next video. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that little bell button for notifications when new videos drop. Check out my Instagram @Sprometheus for more coffee content. Help support the channel by considering becoming a member for unique exclusive perks. And as always, stay caffeinated. Pony Boy.